Joining me is Garret Martin. He's a senior professorial lecturer at American University's School of International Service and the co-director of the Transatlantic Policy Centre. Thank you very much for your time, Garret. Now, G7 leaders are under pressure to be united in their approach against increasing Russian aggression. What are the divisions that are making this difficult?
Well, I think the challenge is that there are sort of differences over the exact end game here when it comes to the conflict. I think there's general unity in terms of imposing cost on Russia and punishing Russia's actions, but in terms of the exact balance between when to negotiate or how much to make Russia suffer, there are, of course, differences that predated the conflict insofar. But I would say, those differences aside, there is still a high degree of unity amongst the countries of the G7.
Now, sanctions are being stepped up. We've got a ban on gold imports, a possible cap on Russian oil, but sanctions haven't done a lot to really punish Russia or to curb the aggression in Ukraine right now. How might these particular sanctions be different, do you think?
Well, I think there's a problem of sometimes of expectations. I mean, sanctions are not a magic bullet, and they can rarely compel a country or a leader like Putin, who is dead set on a certain course of action, to change his mind immediately. But I think it is important to look at the longer-term consequences that the sanctions will impose on the Russian economy. Even if the war ended tomorrow, there would still be significant impacts in terms of Russia becoming more and more of a pariah on the financial market. I mean, we heard about defaulting on its debt today. It will take years for foreign investors to want to invest once again in Russia. The export controls on key issues like semiconductors or computer chips will have long-term effects on depressing the Russian economy. So yes, not immediate impact, but I would say the long-term consequences will be stark.
One of the big, of course, curveballs, though, is trying to get countries like China and India involved. As long as these very large neutral countries are engaging economically with Russia, then Russia's going to have plenty of money to fuel its war. What do you think the goal is for the G7 in inviting countries like India to the table? Is this an attempt to try and coax them into participating in sanctions?
I think it is. I mean, there is a degree to which there's an understanding that it cannot simply be viewed as a war between the West and Russia, that this is a global conflict with global consequences. So there's certainly a narrative battle between the West on the one hand and Russia. A large number of countries, 143 countries did condemn Russia at the UN, but there was still a large number who either abstained or voted against resolutions. So there's certainly an element of trying to make sure that those countries on the fence agree that Russia is responsible and alone responsible for this conflict. And I think it's also an element that although the war in Ukraine is key and is really capturing a lot of the attention, there are other serious problems also happening in the world, whether over climate change, over the supply chain disruptions and so forth, or the food insecurity. So it's also a way to signal to the global community that the West is trying to focus on these other problems as well.
Of course, the urgent need for food supply coming out of Ukraine, not just to support Ukraine's economy, but for the developing countries in continents like Africa, is a big issue on the table too. What can G7 leaders do to create a safe passage for these agricultural shipping exports?
I think it's been incredibly difficult. There have been some attempts by the UN and Turkey, I believe, to try and find a mediation to address this issue. There have been other plans floated. I believe the British government talked of some kind of Dunkirk-style evacuation, mentioning what happened during World War II with the evacuation of British soldiers. But it's certainly a complicated solution, and there's no obvious and easy solution in sight for the moment.
Really appreciate your time. Garret Martin there from American University's School of International Service.